Hello guys, before continuing with today's video, please consider subscribing if you like the contents of this channel. Thank you. Now let's begin. I moved in with my uncle who had a strange set of rules. When I was 12, I was forced to spend a summer with my great uncle Jeremy. You see, I was a bit of a troublemaker back in those days. My parents thought if I spent some time with my strict grouch of an uncle, I would somehow be rehabilitated. You can imagine how hard my eyes rolled when my mom and dad told me about their plan, but I was oblivious to the horrors I would endure that summer. Uncle Jeremy was somewhat of a mountain man. He lived in the remote wilderness of Montana's high pine forest. A homesteader through and through, he'd made a life where most people would go insane. Granted, Uncle Jeremy did seem a bit kooky to me at the time. My dad almost tossed me out of the car as we rolled into my uncle's mountain cabin. He didn't even wait for Uncle Jeremy to greet me at the door. I watched as Dad's little Prius made its way back down the long driveway and onto the unkempt dirt road. While I was a bit offended by how I'd just been abandoned, I was not envious of the long journey ahead of him. It took us almost 2 hours to traverse that nasty road. I was sure we'd be left stranded at one point or another. A Prius is no off-roading vehicle. The hybrid's taillights disappeared among the dense forest. My attention turned to the rickety wooden cabin. This house was not what you would imagine it to be. It wasn't the picturesque idea people have when they think of a log cabin. I could see the structure had been through a lot. The logs were weathered, faded by the hot Montana summer and the icy winter winds. I could tell that everything used in its construction was sourced from the surrounding forest. Likewise, no modern amenities were visible. No power lines, fire hydrants, or even a satellite dish. I knew then it would be a duller summer than I'd imagined. I lifted a hand to knock on the old door and stopped when I noticed a few deep scratch marks on its facade. Bears? I thought to myself. An uneasy feeling that I was being watched from the pines came over me. I cocked my head in the direction of the tree line. It felt like something was calling me over to the woods. The door squealed open, and I returned my gaze to the cabin. In the passageway stood a gray-bearded man, the fibers in his beard long, greasy, and matted. His skin was old and weathered. I suspected the same reasoning as the cabin's. He looked at me through the gray film in his eyes. I'd never actually met Uncle Jeremy up until that point, but I'd heard stories about him from my father. My father had suffered the same fate as me the summer between 7th and 8th grade. He told me Uncle Jeremy was not a man to be trifled with. You listen to everything your Uncle Jeremy tells you. He is not a man you want to make angry, my father would lecture. But when I looked into the face of the withering man, I didn't sense an ounce of animosity. He almost seemed kind. Nothing resembled the ferocity my father had mentioned. "Hi, I'm Marcus." I outstretched my hand in the introduction, but he slapped it away before placing a hand over my mouth. "Shh! We don't say names here." He moved my head over to the side to make sure no one or nothing was listening. More of my father's description of my great-uncle came to mind. Uncle Jeremy is a bit strange, but he has your best interest in mind. Try your best to ignore his lack of civility. His words were all starting to make sense now. Uncle Jeremy ushered me into the cabin, and I thought I heard him whisper my name as he pushed me inside. That is, until I turned to see the look of fear in his eyes. I knew then that the sound had drifted in on the early summer breeze, somewhere beyond the tree line. The hairs on the back of my neck stood. "Is everything okay, Uncle Jeremy?" His open palm slapped my cheek as I spoke his name. "Damn it, kid! I told you no names," he said through gritted teeth before returning his gaze to the tree line. Almost like a dream, a faint voice slithered into the cabin. The voice called, "What the hell is that?" I asked, but received no reply. Uncle Jeremy quickly slammed the door shut. Rule number 1, no names. I dropped my gaze at his reprimand. Rule number 2, if you hear something strange, leave. It be. Ignore it. You hear me? I pondered his instructions before moving to question his logic. Why? Not another word on the matter. Those are the rules. My only rules. You follow them, or I'll send you back to your little life in Boise. You hear me? Just then, my escape from homestead living became clear. Break a few rules here and there, and I'd be back in the gem state. I tried not to smile at the plot that was formulating in my mind. Your room is down yonder. The old man pointed down a small hallway before leading me to it himself. We stepped into a small 10 by 10 room. I threw my backpack onto the bed and plopped down right beside it, giving a grunt of relief. What do you think you're doing, kid? This isn't some luxurious mountain retreat. I eyed the crumbling wooden walls. The understatement of the century, I thought to myself. We've got work to do, Uncle Jeremy said, his voice clipped as he pushed open the shutters. The air that poured in was sharp and cold, carrying the faint metallic scent of soil turned too many times. Outside, the clearing stretched wide and empty, the forest beyond it dense and almost impenetrable. The garden plots, carefully tended, seemed too orderly against the wild backdrop of the trees. Chickens clucked nervously in their coop, and a lone goat pawed the ground near the fence. Jeremy turned back to me, his expression shadowed by the dim evening light. You thought you could come here and take it easy? His voice carried no humor now. This is no free ride. We work for our food. He strode to the corner of the room, yanked open a drawer, and pulled out a pair of worn overalls. They looked ancient, stained with soil and streaked with dark patches of edge frets I didn't want to identify. Put these on, he ordered, and keep them on. You'll need them. The day stretched endlessly. We weeded the garden, hauling up roots that seemed far too deep, almost as if they were trying to cling to the earth. The animals were skittish. Bessie, the cow, recoiled at every movement, her wide eyes darting to the tree line. Even the chickens huddled together as if they knew something I didn't. By the time the sun sank low, casting long, claw-like shadows over the clearing, my body ached in ways I'd never experienced. When we finally returned to the cabin, I collapsed onto the bed. The air inside was stifling, but I didn't care. I was too tired to move. Sleep came quickly, but it didn't last. I woke to a sound, a faint, rhythmic scratching. Scratch, scratch, scratch. At first, it blended it into the creaks of the old cabin, but as I listened, I realized it was too deliberate, too steady. The noise grew louder, dragging on the wood like nails. My pulse quickened as I sat up in bed, peering into the shadows. The room was dim, the only light coming from the sliver of moon that peeked through the shutters. I stared at the window, frozen, as the scratching continued. Then it stopped. For a moment, silence filled the room, thick and suffocating. I began to relax, telling myself it was just the wind or an animal. But then I heard it, a voice. Faint, thin, and distant, but unmistakably human. Marcus! My heart stopped. The voice was hollow, stretched, like it had been dragged across a great distance. I couldn't tell if it came from outside or inside the cabin. I turned toward the window just in time to see the latch on the shutters slowly beginning to lift. Uncle Jeremy, I screamed, my voice cracking. Footsteps thundered down the hallway, and my door slammed open. Jeremy stood there, his rifle in hand, his face pale and grim. He didn't say a word as he strode to the window, slammed the shutters closed, and locked them with trembling hands. You left them unlocked? His voice was low, almost a growl. I didn't know I was supposed to, I stammered. Jeremy's jaw tightened. Rule number 1, he said through gritted teeth. Always lock the shutters at night. Always. What was that? I asked, my voice shaking. He didn't answer immediately. He leaned against the wall, his shoulders tense. You don't want to know, and if you hear your name again, ignore it. No matter how much it sounds like me or anyone else. My stomach churned. What do you mean? What's out there? He gave me a hard look. Something that listens, and now it knows you're here. The weight of his words pressed on me like a physical force. He left the room without another word, leaving me alone with the echo of the voice in my head. The next morning, the sunlight felt wrong, too bright and harsh against the eerie stillness of the clearing. Uncle Jeremy led me outside to the side of the cabin where the scratching had come from. I expected claw marks or scuffs. What I saw was far worse. Carved into the wood were symbols, sharp, jagged lines intersecting in a way that made my eyes hurt to follow. They didn't look random, they felt deliberate, purposeful. Above the symbols were 2 names, Jeremy and Marcus. I turned to Uncle Jeremy, my mouth dry. What does this mean? He didn't answer. His gaze was fixed on the forest, his hand resting on the handle of his revolver. The trees seemed closer now, their edges blurred as though they were shifting ever so slightly. A sharp cry broke the silence. It was Bessie, her bellow loud and guttural. Jeremy's face darkened, and he took off toward the pasture. I followed, my chest tight with dread. When we reached her, I stumbled back. Bessie was trembling violently, her eyes rolling in terror. The gate to her pen was ajar, its hinges bent and twisted. Jeremy crouched by the fence, his hand brushing over the ground. His fingers hovered over deep impressions in the soil, long, narrow grooves that seemed to drag toward the forest. "It's starting," he muttered under his breath. I wanted to ask what he meant, but the words wouldn't come. "Poor Bessie," Uncle Jeremy said. I could tell that seeing his cow suffer made him emotional. I moved to comfort him, but before my hand could grace his shoulder, he stood. He unholstered the magnum and pointed it at Bessie's head. One shot rang out as every bird in the vicinity took flight. Bessie was dead. She now lay in a pool of blood. Uncle Jeremy wiped away some tears before turning around and walking briskly back to the cabin. "Come on, kid. We have to get ready." I knew that we were heading for some kind of battle. When the night fell on the cabin that day, Uncle Jeremy and I did not talk. We had barricaded ourselves and all of the livestock inside the little cabin. A total of 22 chickens, 7 goats, and a variety of domesticated geese. He'd thrust a rifle in my hand and give me instructions on how to shoot, though he said not to use it unless something happened to him. For the most part, the night was quiet. The chickens and geese had roosted for the night, and the goats had lost the excitement of being in a new environment. They now huddled together in a corner of the living room. I would almost say it was peaceful, until every animal began screeching at the top of their lungs. The birds flocked around the house. The goats erupted in a panic, running around trying to find any hiding place they could. Most now cowered under the dining room table. Almost as quickly as the commotion began, it all quieted down. I looked at Uncle Jeremy in bewilderment, but the look in his eye told me he'd seen all of this before. His eyes trained on the door. A familiar sound slid across the other side. It was the scratching that we'd heard the night before. In the same fashion, the scratching intensified before it erupted into a frenzy of banging. I eyed the door as the latch struggled to keep whatever was on the other side out. A voice soon followed suit. "Jeremy, Jeremy, Jeremy. Oh, Uncle Jeremy." It sounded like me. For some reason, whatever was on the other side was using my voice as bait. The voice changed to that of Uncle Jeremy's. "Marcus, open the door, Marcus." Uncle Jeremy looked at me before raising his revolver to the door. One shot rang out, and the sound of something hitting the floor was evident from our vantage point. My uncle took to his feet and made his way over to the door, revolver at the ready. I wanted to tell him to stay put, but couldn't find the courage. He opened the top latch, followed by the bottom. The door cautiously creaked open, and Uncle Jeremy peered out of the small crack. I will remember the words that came from his mouth for the rest of my life. "Oh no." Suddenly, a clawed hand reached through the small crack in the door and pulled him from the cabin. I heard screams, but wasn't sure if they belonged to Uncle Jeremy or the thing impersonating him. Everything went quiet, and I wrestled with the idea of seeing what the outcome of the skirmish was. Just then, I heard a voice that brought me a mountain of relief. "It's okay, kid. I got him." I heard Uncle Jeremy grunt as he seemingly took to his feet from the other side of the door. But as the door slowly swung open, my heart dropped. It wasn't my uncle. It was the creature that had taken him. Its body was tall and skinny, its skin pale, and its face, well, it had no face, just a plain identity. But as it stood there and turned in my direction, a mouth began to part. Skin stuck to its upper and lower jaws like stretched rubber until they eventually gave way to sharp teeth. It spoke one more time in my uncle's voice. "Marcus." It took to a sprint, and when it was just feet from me, a revolver round spat out. The creature flopped to the floor in a pool of green fluid. Standing at the door was my injured Uncle Jeremy. After that night, I had no problems following any of Uncle Jeremy's rules, no matter how arbitrary they were. We worked his homestead all summer, and I never mentioned his name again. I was never one for rules, but in this instance, I was not going to summon another creature. Although I would see things dart beyond the tree line, I never mentioned them. At the end of the summer, I was adamant that I would never spend another day with my Uncle Jeremy. A model citizen through and through. 10 years later, I received word that my great-uncle Jeremy had passed. At first, I suspected old age. He was ancient, after all. but my father informed me that it had been a bear attack that ended his life. He was a hard man, and a hard man deserved to go out fighting, I thought to myself. But then I started to question if a bear was really the culprit. My thoughts turned to the creature that once called from the other side of the cabin walls. I thought of its blank face and jagged claws. The day before I was set to leave for his funeral, I received a letter in the mail. The address it was sent from was Uncle Jeremy's P.O. box. I'd assumed he'd left something in his will for me, but as I unsealed the letter, I found a single piece of paper. Written in what appeared to be dried ink was the same circle Uncle Jeremy and I had found carved on the other side of the cabin walls, the lines drawn across it just as jagged. I looked to the top of the circle. The same two names were written out, only this time one was crossed out, Uncle Jeremy's. At that second, I heard faint scratching from the other side of my house in Idaho. I don't know how, but one of them found me.